Okay, so let's dive in here and look at the next layer of analysis, which again is these collective outer planet alignments, which can last anywhere from uh, 2 to 3 years, in some cases, as long as 20 years in the case of Neptune Pluto's cycle, which hasn't happened in a long time and isn't going to happen for a while here. But then there are other alignments that are shorter, more like 10 to 15 years. And this first alignment we're going to talk about is about a 10-year process. The collective Uranus Pluto square, which we've been in since about 2007, 2008, within the 10-degree orb 2008 to 2020, the tight orb 2010 to 2018. So we're in that tighter orb phase. It was quite powerful from 2008. It's just that it has deepened even more since 2010, 11, and I think 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. These years, the energy has just been increasing and increasing to the point where it's really saturating the collective. So this is another way in which the Pluto energy and the Uranus energy is very amplified. So we looked at the Pluto cycle itself with the Pluto return, but now we're looking at Uranus square Pluto. And I just want to name some of the key themes that are associated with this archetypal combination. I'm just going to kind of list these things. I think in most cases it's kind of obvious the connections to our current historical moment, but I'll try to amplify here and there. So some of the key themes for the Uranus Pluto archetype are mass scale revolutionary change and disruptions. All of the kind of revolutionary, rebellious energies that have been present with, the revolutionary election of an African American president, to the Occupy Wall Street movement, WikiLeaks, and the Standing Rock protests. Um, Mass scale revolution around the world. With the Arab Spring and protests in many different places around the world. You see this combination with periods where there are rapid evolutionary growth spurts. It's kind of punctuated equilibrium energy where you get these especially strong evolutionary moments. So think about the difference between the 1950s and the 1970s. In between, in the 60s, we had a Uranus Pluto conjunction. That was the end of a whole Uranus Pluto cycle and the beginning of a whole nother Uranus Pluto cycle. And now we're at the square point, and so whatever was started in the 60s is now reaching a kind of crossroad of developmental growth. And whatever was started in the 60s at the square point is likely to go through some kind of crisis, or even a sense of kind of moving backwards in areas where in the 60s there was progress. So there can be both this sense of powerfully moving in the direction of the future, but also in the sense that there can be a kind of awakening of the underworld energies, the shadow energies, to such a degree that it actually brings up all of the issues of the previous alignment, in this case the 60s, and kind of forces another round of really working through those areas. And so, other things I've wrote here, the awakening Uranus of the will to power, which is more Pluto. This is very related to the strong men that have emerged around the world, Putin and Trump and many others. Who's the guy in the Philippines and in France, the woman Marie Le Pen, I believe is her name. This kind of awakening to that shadow impulse towards power and control and domination. Another form is, I've kind of been saying this, the awakening of previously repressed unconscious shadow material, as in misogyny, sexism, the whole thing around Trump, and the sexual molestation, the rape, uh, Native American genocide, oppression, with the Standing Rock protests, slavery and racism, with the Black Lives Matter movement, uh, power differentials and class dynamics, the Occupy Wall Street movement, the impulse towards revolution in all of these areas, as well as the backlash that often comes in response to strong Uranus energy. This is the history. This archetype relates to the history of revolution and civil disobedience. See Rick Tarnas for an expansion of this. I've got some notes at the end where you can see Tarnas's work. Um, just to mention one other big Uranus Pluto alignment, the French Revolution, 1789 through the 1790s, was a Uranus Pluto opposition. You can think about all of the sexual energy, the eruption of destructive energies, the guillotine, the violence, the protests. So that's the kind of energy we're living under now. It's very much a late third matrix energy, like I was talking about earlier. Pluto itself is third matrix, but to with Uranus relating to the actual birth, and Pluto being that lead up to birth, you can see where the two together could particularly um, bring up the very latest stages in the birth process, where that struggle is very close to the liberation, which is a kind of dangerous moment actually, because it can bring forth a level of violent and aggressive energies that are aware that there might be freedom very close, and so there can be like a really explosive level of energy that comes up in this particular stage of birth. Um, let's see. Yeah, I mentioned the previous Uranus Pluto conjunction. The last square that we were in, where there's very similar quality, is the period from 1928 to 38. Of course, in the sense of the Great Depression and the rise of fascism, the rise of Hitler and Stalin and others. Um, Obviously, strong parallels. Many people have been drawing the connections between the 1930s and our current moment, and the same astrology is present in both time periods. Okay, now I want to focus on another alignment that's very strong currently. It's a shorter term alignment. It's within, and this is the Jupiter square Pluto alignment I mentioned earlier and showed the chart. Maybe it's worth going back to the chart here. Here's the chart for January 20th. But all these alignments I've been talking about were very strong on election day. Uh, you can see this T square that I mentioned, the Jupiter Uranus opposition forming a T square with Pluto. So there's both a Jupiter Uranus energy to explore and a Jupiter Pluto combination. And so let's go back to this Jupiter Pluto square is within 10 degrees from October 2016 to September 2017, within 5 degrees November to August. And so we're very solidly in this energy since the election and currently. So, some of the key themes of Jupiter Pluto: Jupiter makes things bigger and grander, and kind of it can bring a kind of over the top quality where things are like too big. And it also has other very positive qualities. It has to do with success, good fortune, um, abundance, positivity. And yet, with Pluto, Pluto tends to bring out the shadow side of things, tends to bring out the dark side of things. And so, especially in a square like we have now, I mentioned down here a couple of the examples of the shadow side, Pluto, of Jupiter. Jupiter has a lot to do with arrogance and superiority. and Pluto just intensifies whatever it's combining with tremendous power. And so that tendency that Jupiter has in the direction of arrogance and superiority is volcanically intensified. And so any of us at this time need to be looking at our issues around superiority, looking at any way in which we feel superior to any other being on the planet. Jupiter, Pluto has a lot to do with looking at superiority, whether that's superiority between a man and a woman, between gay and straight, between uh, um, races, between nations, between humans and nature. Any way in which we feel superior is related to this combination. Another one here I've written is where Jupiter has to do with like high culture and has something to do with the more successful individuals, what are called the elites, whether that's the elites in science or academia or in terms of finance. Um, Jupiter is the elites versus Pluto, which can relate to the masses. Pluto has this kind of massive quality, and so it relates to masses of people. Um, Other things I've written here, it's been called, Rick Tarnas calls it the political thriller archetype. You can see it with somebody like Tom Cruise, who's born with Jupiter opposite Pluto, with his Mission Impossible films. That's the kind of energy, and we can really feel that. It is the archetype of international high drama. The political thriller energy of this moment is intense. The drama between Russia and the United States and the Turkey Syria drama and the all the different elements that are happening. It's just sort of like, whoa, it's over the top. And I think this is why it's just so compelling to be following the news about it and to be reading all about it and to be concerned and open to what's going on, is to be in touch with this kind of over the top energy. I sometimes call it the United Nations archetype, so it has a lot to do with global power dynamics. Um, Moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis, Jupiter opposite Pluto, the 1968 Democratic Convention, the Bush v. Gore election was a Jupiter Pluto opposition. The grand drama of U.S. Russian relations. That's Jupiter Pluto. Has a lot to do with wealth and power. Jupiter's wealth, Pluto's power. So, wealthy and powerful individuals and their impact on the world, for good or for ill. Also, the wealth and power of nations, swaggering their influence in the world. The Jupiter Pluto combination has a lot to do with the process of empire. It is also the positive response to the forces of empire. It has a potential for moral power. Jupiter is higher moral values and Pluto power. So you see it in somebody like Gandhi or Nelson Mandela, who both have Jupiter Pluto hard aspect alignments. The higher moral principles of Jupiter combine with the profound force of nature which Pluto represents. The danger here is for righteousness and superiority. Um, Down below here, I've named that it seems to have something to do with alpha males and alpha females, type A individuals. In this sense, where Pluto is our is biology and our animal nature, Jupiter grants success to it. So it's like the successful animal, um, the elite animal, and so it has something to do perhaps with the drive, the instinct that many people have to become that um, alpha elite ape, as we are seeing very clearly in our president elect. So, other themes, sometimes Rick Tarnas calls it the smiling demon archetype. Jupiter brings a smile, and Pluto can be that kind of demonic energy. Think of Jack Nicholson in The Shining. born with Jupiter, Pluto, Mick Jagger, born with a conjunction, and his song Sympathy for the Devil, and the kind of celebratory energy um, with the stones of the dark side. Let it bleed. That kind of quality. Think of Jack Nicholson's kind of demonic smile in The Shining. So, um, or another example is uh, Anthony Hopkins in the role of Hannibal Lecter. In that case, it's an interesting example of somebody who identifies as an elite, as somebody who has a superior understanding of literature and music and the arts, and he is that kind of high culture figure, but then he has this incredible dark side, and so you often see that with individuals who identify as superior and then are out of touch with the shadow that they are acting out. So I've written here the potential split between the moral high ground, Jupiter, and the projection of shadow. The high culture elitist with projected shadow, righteousness. It seems to have something to do with a relentless drive towards success, a drive towards excellence, where there is a willingness to act out the shadow in the pursuit of success or wealth. Has a lot to do with greed. Think of Nixon with his Jupiter Pluto opposition. Because Trump feels that he has the morally and intellectually superior position on everything, he feels justified in doing or saying anything taboo or ugly. By any means necessary, the ends justify the means. And this often leads to another Jupiter Pluto potential, the powerful king or queen who falls into the underworld, overtaken by their shadow material. With somebody like Nixon or Saddam Hussein, think about Saddam Hussein going from the palace to the spider hole. I think there's certainly a potential with Trump that there could be this kind of total fall into the underworld in a way where he's destroyed, impeached, or however it might happen. But yeah, Jupiter Pluto has that potential for falling from the mountaintop peaks down into a kind of destroyed shadow world. And um, the more positive potential, both for individuals and for groups, is where through something like the South African Truth and Reconciliation Council, or for an individual, something like the fourth step process and the 12-step program of AA, which is made of a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Through these processes where the collective or the individual reconciles themselves with the reality of their shadow unconscious material, then there's the sense that the superiority can be humbled through an integration of the shadow. We come to see that we can celebrate ourselves and feel positive about ourselves without needing to feel superior to others. And we can accept our shadow without shame, while at the same time instituting, both within individuals and collectives, the kinds of checks and balances that recognize the power of that shadow. And of course, this is one of the real problems with the American situation, is that the checks and balances that the founders of the Constitution put in place specifically to protect the nation from the move to power that we see in Trump, or the impulse to have power and domination over others. Um, the founders put in all these different checks and balances with you know the the balance between states' rights and national laws, and the balance between the Supreme Court and the Congress and the executive branch of the government. All these checks were put in place to prevent something like what's happening. And so we're dealing with the systematic erosion of the checks and balances. And so we will have to move back in that direction, and also do that work within ourselves, where we create our own checks and balances, to avoid acting out the shadow. Now, the collective Jupiter opposite Uranus, very special alignment that we're living under, and I think it's a very helpful and hopeful energy for this particular year. This is why I feel like our current moment up through the end of the year is just like crucial. How we work with this situation, this first year of the Trump administration, is so important. My own intuitive sense is that they're going to move fast with their agenda. I think they're going to move real fast. And so we're going to have to really do our work very deeply on all levels right from the beginning. And so we got to get it together. We got to do our grief work and then get busy. What is Jupiter opposite Uranus? It's happening within 10 degrees from November 2016 to April 2017. It's within 5 degrees from December to April, and then again within 5 degrees September, October 2017. Um, and so, yeah, this is the archetype of wide eyed amazement. Uranus is that quality of breakthrough, breaking beyond the ordinary to the extraordinary. It is the um, the breaking beyond the status quo and the ordinary. And so when you see something that's outside of the status quo, there can be this kind of surprising wow quality. But Jupiter makes things bigger, more successful, grander, potentially over the top. And so you put the two together and you get this kind of wow, wide eyed amazement energy. And that can go in different directions. I mean, we're seeing it certainly in the election with just sort of that sense of, wow, what is going on? For those who supported Trump, there's a kind of euphoria that is a dimension of Jupiter Uranus, where Jupiter's joy combines with the Uranus liberation feeling, breakthrough feeling to create this kind of it can be a kind of manic state of consciousness that is so excited about what's happening that it's not grounded and it's not cautious in a responsible way. Um, you can see it. It was in the sky at the beginning of World War One, and the initial excitement that everyone around the world was feeling about going to war. There was a kind of thrill of that moment for many people, and then the confrontation with the hard realities and dark dimensions of the dark, destructive dimensions of that moment in history. So there is a kind of additional danger to this Jupiter Uranus in that sense uh, that in this moment of kind of manic excitement that the let's call it the fascist uh, oligarchic individuals that are both running things and are also the masses of people that are feeling that way. It can be dangerous. It can be a gambler energy. It can take real big risks. And so those are some of the shadow potentials. But coming back to this list here, it can be quite a positive sense of the amazing positive potentials of both individual lives and the historical situation. Um, and so it's associated with amazing breakthrough achievements in science and technology and politics, the arts and literature, moments that have this kind of wow breakthrough energy, like the landing on the moon was a Jupiter Uranus conjunction, or the fall of the Berlin Wall was a Jupiter Uranus opposition, or the beginning of sound films, or the more recently, the Arab Spring, that kind of political breakthrough. And so it can be the successful revolution, and with Pluto, mass scale successful revolutions where there is a global impact. Now, this can be a conservative revolution, but it could also be a progressive revolution, and it seems as though both are happening. Um, the likelihood of especially large protests and acts of civil disobedience, which those of us who have the ability to do that kind of work, it's crucial that as many people as possible are doing massive civil disobedience. Although there is a lot of danger with that, more danger than ever before, it seems, in terms of if we look at something like Standing Rock, the um, peaceful protest that has been happening there, the level of violence that's been unleashed against those individuals, those people practicing civil disobedience, is pretty extreme. And so it takes a lot of courage to do that kind of work at this moment. Um, and let's see. Another version is the arrogant revolutionary with elitist sentiment. So you combine that Jupiter Pluto sense of superiority and greed together with the rebel energy of Uranus, and you can get this kind of arrogant revolutionary. It can be the joyful breakthrough, it can be rebirth. It has an amazing creative energy, expanding beyond all previous limits. On a personal level, this is an alignment that is very favorable for individual psychological breakthroughs. Great time for inner work. It's part of the paradox of this moment that it's so kind of heavy and dark, and yet I think there's a lot of potential, and maybe some of you are feeling it, that through this confrontation with the shadow, there is a potential liberation that can happen. And so I think it's so important that we all create space in our lives for deep inner work, so that we can have these potential psychospiritual breakthroughs that, of course, could make us much more effective change agents. And so um, the breakthroughs and victories achieved this year will be the front line of the battles to follow during the rest of the Trump administration. And so this Jupiter Uranus, with its potential for successful revolutionary actions, um, I think we have to make the most of it during this time, because I think the energy is most likely to get harder in the years ahead, and I'll show you some of the future alignments that we're moving into. Um, the last thing I wrote here is that the shadow of Jupiter Uranus has something to do with overexpansive manic revolutionary energy that's not grounded in reality, flying too close to the sun, the Icarus archetype. Somebody like Napoleon at Waterloo, he's born with Jupiter Uranus. The fireworks of rebirth that represent only a temporary escape, as in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, where things have returned to a difficult situation in some of those countries, um, which that Arab Spring happened under the last Jupiter Uranus conjunction. So let's see, what else did I write here? Okay, so that's the Jupiter Uranus energy. Now, another really crucial archetype for understanding our current moment is the Saturn Neptune archetype. We have Saturn square Neptune within 10 degrees November 2014 to September 2017, within 5 degrees January 15 to April 15, and October 15 to January 16, and April 16 to November 16. So at the election, it was within 5 degrees. It's no longer within 5 degrees. It's actually, I think it's actually at almost 10 degrees currently, and or no, it's more than 10 degrees. And so it's weakening. This last year, it's operative through September 2017, but it's weakening. I think we're more in an integration phase, although it's so saturating the collective after these 2 years that it still feels super strong, and we're all like working with it still and trying to integrate it, trying to take the lessons of it and gain the wisdom of it. And so some of the positive themes for Saturn Neptune are things like spiritual maturation. Neptune has to do with spirituality, consciousness, our spiritual visions, our ideals, our dreams. It has something to do with surrender, letting go, being at peace, but it also has a quality of confusion, escapism. It seems to have something to do with drugs and alcohol and numbing out and dissociation and different forms of psychopathology. So it is quite a challenging archetype. Remember, Saturn has to do with the tests and challenges and existential hard realities of life, as well as the positive potential for wisdom and maturity and strength and discipline. And so these positive themes that I'm mentioning at the beginning have to do with those more positive dimensions of Saturn and Neptune. So Neptune spirituality, Saturn maturation, and so it's the spiritual maturation process that Saturn Neptune represents. We're all in a 2-3 year period of consciousness maturation. That's the positive potential of this time period, and I do see that in many ways. There's a kind of psychological and spiritual maturity that comes through under this energy, both in individuals and collectives. And I think we see it in the maturity, the psychological maturity of the response to Trump, the level of psychological sophistication in um, uh, seeing Trump's personality for what it is, and the incredible um, capacity that we've had since Jung to have this kind of mature understanding of the unconscious. I think it's just gone to another level here in the last couple of years. We're also seeing it in something like the more mature relationship to psychedelic self-exploration, all of the positive research that's been happening, and positive attitudes, the potential for MDMA being a legal medicine, and of course, the legalization of marijuana in many states. Um, uh, this is the positive side of Saturn Neptune. It also relates to spiritual discipline, something that we all have to be engaged in at this time. Grounded states of consciousness, so important for us to stay grounded. It has something to do with spiritual humility. We've all been humbled in this time period. It can be the mature vision. And I think that's what we are striving to have right now, a mature vision for our potential future that can guide us. It's the capacity to make a dream, Neptune, a reality, Saturn. It has something to do with, these are the more challenging sides of it, disillusionment, disappointment. It can feel like the end of a dream, the end of the death of the American dream. Think about another Saturn Neptune square, 62, 63, and the assassination of Kennedy, and that sense of the death of Camelot, the end of the dream of Camelot, which really was a fantasy. It wasn't totally grounded in the reality of what was happening during those 3 years. Um, can be Paradise Lost, and a more positive capacity to get real and face reality. That's the positive Saturn against the illusion, the false illusions that Neptune can also represent. Neptune is Maya, and so. Yeah, the capacity to face reality without naive illusions, usually after a successful grief process. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is born with Saturn Neptune. Of course, she wrote and described what she discovered as the stages of the grief process. And I think looking to Kubler-Ross to understand some of what we're dealing with, the anger phase, the denial phase, the depression phase, acceptance. It takes a while to move through those stages. Um, and so, what else? Working with difficult states of consciousness, working with fear and anxiety, the way in which the media and leaders, and on an individual level, parents and teachers use fear to manipulate the masses, but also the capacity to resist this fear programming. Um, Depression, melancholy, the bad trip, but also the mastery of consciousness, which can transform pain. Oh, I just lost my Okay, I'm back here, and we just left off with this idea of the mastering of consciousness, which can transform pain into the gifts of hard won maturation. This is a transit that has a lot to do with um, working with your own psyche to expand beyond fear consciousness, beyond anxiety and uh, melancholy. Um, and so you get other qualities where Neptune is dreams and Saturn brings challenges. And so it can have this quality of like waking up in a nightmare, which many people felt the day after the election and since. The dystopian vision becoming reality, being haunted by the past. Haunting energy is Saturn Neptune. The dystopian thing is it's like dark visions. If you think of a story like Clockwork Orange, both the novelist is born with Saturn Neptune, and the film came out under Saturn opposite Neptune. That sense of um, facing a gray dystopian reality and um, and working with it. Other qualities, is it real or isn't it? Where Saturn has to do with reality and Neptune is illusory or Maya. The way in which deception, Neptune, can fog reality, the fake news, the spin bubble, being trapped within a false understanding of reality, as opposed to the above mentioned capacity to face reality without illusions, which I think we're challenged to do right now. I don't think this is a moment for Pollyanna, naive, uh, just pure hopefulness. There's a kind of deadly serious reality that we're all facing here, and we should not be naive about that. And there's something about like really directly facing reality without illusions that can be grounding and strengthening, and it can bring a kind of backbone to face the darkness. Um, Saturn Neptune seems to relate to the toxic womb. Um, Neptune being the womb and Saturn bringing in the toxicity, where there's anxiety about a perceived threat, that sense of being in a toxic situation where um, there's threats all around, and the fear and anxiety that comes with that. The McCarthy era begins under Saturn conjunct Neptune, and you get the kind of emerging internet blacklists against college professors. Um, the sense that both the right and the left have this kind of fear, the fear of the threats of terrorism and the fears that the right has about the potential threats of immigrants and so forth. But on the progressive side, um, the sense of anxiety and fear about all the potential toxic situations that could be in our future. Themes with water. Neptune is the water element. Pollution, droughts, reef die-offs, the water protectors is the more positive side. Um, Drain the swamp. All of the awareness of the situation of pollutions of uh, waterways and oceans and coral reefs and so forth. Um, it's all relevant. This drain the swamp idea is where Neptune's the water, Saturn is the swampiness of the water, as opposed to the pure, clear waters of Hawaii or somewhere. Um, Building a bridge from a dream to reality, from heaven to earth. The I Have a Dream speech happened under Saturn square Neptune. Potential for a kind of faith growing in the darkness. So, through drawing on the spiritual levels, it can strengthen us to face the hard realities, and there can be a kind of solidity of faith that emerges that overcomes the fear. So we call it the faith overcoming fear archetype. You see it in somebody like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his famous line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." We're certainly in one of those moments. There's a particular form of spiritual awakening that is triggered and forged in incredibly difficult circumstances. Thinking of someone I know who had her father dying with a very serious illness, and she was taking care of him. Very painful time, Saturn, but then towards the end of it, there was this kind of glorious spiritual energy where she was seeing angels in the room and the spiritual connection with her father and the soul of her father. Um, uh, that kind of beautiful spiritual experience happening in the midst of the painful reality. And so there's something very poignant about Saturn Neptune and Saturn Neptune time periods. I've been feeling it recently, like the simultaneity of the pain that's there, but then also these very subtle and meaningful spiritual insights that have been coming to me in the recent weeks. Is more of the positive side. I wrote Oscar Wilde. He had a transit of Pluto and Neptune opposite his Saturn, the Neptune opposite Saturn, when he wrote De Profundis, which he was at the peak of his career with two plays running on the London stage, and then this experience he had of um, being prisoned for his homosexuality, and so that incredible dark moment for him, living in that jail for 2 years, he writes this really incredible, beautiful poem about his spiritual awakening in those circumstances. Um, so I think that's what we're all working towards at this time, is to find that kind of strength of faith, a kind of faith in um, deeper spiritual forces that are allied with us through this time. The last thing I wrote here, working with consciousness practices like prayer, meditation, breathwork, and other technologies of the sacred. I sometimes say about Saturn, Neptune, it's a time period that, or it's an energy that could be called spiritual graduate school. It's like the advanced training on the spiritual path, and so it's a time where we're really meant to take our spiritual practice to the next level of seriousness and commitment, and that's certainly an important way to work with this energy at this time. As I said, the whole next year has this energy, and um, is a way in which all the lessons that have come these first 2 years of the transit can really be put into um, practice in our lives in a more serious way. I think that's a lot of what's happening for some of us, is a kind of realization of new spiritual strengths that are helping us to face this difficult moment. The last thing here is the grief process that reveals deeper truths and leads towards positive actions and self care. Okay. So that gives you a sense of all the biggest energies that are happening collectively. Now, there's some big waves coming. I'm not going to go into details about these. I'm not going to review the themes that go with these alignments. But I'll just mention we're moving into a big Saturn Pluto conjunction starting in the spring of 2018, getting stronger in early 2019 and lasting through 2021. Um, this is a pretty deadly serious alignment, and it has coincided with powerful contractions. Pluto is the powerful, the intense, and Saturn is contraction. Um, uh, the powerful historical contractions, the most powerful ones, often correspond to Saturn Pluto time periods. Uh, and so it's certainly a serious one. We would hope that we would have the most mature and cautious of presidents to navigate through a time like this. The most recent Saturn Pluto opposition happened under 9/11, and that whole time period, the that devastating moment for the world, and then the very devastating response to it with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Saturn Pluto does seem to have something to do with war, and I think we all have to be um, aware of the real serious possibility that we may be heading into new military conflict. Certainly feels like that could happen, and yet Saturn Pluto is the combination of facing the shadow with a kind of moral integrity and strength. Saturn Pluto has gravitas, and it's a time where uh, we can find a kind of a strength that can confront the shadow in a way that is quite positive. So it will draw forth from us this kind of strength in the coming years. Then there's a Saturn Uranus square within 10 degrees from January 2020 to January 2023. Um, 2020 is a big year with both Saturn conjunct Pluto and Saturn square Uranus. The Saturn square Uranus has a whole potential for crisis and revolution and um, civil war in its more extreme forms. And it's within 5 degrees that February to May in 2020. And then throughout the whole year, both Saturn conjunct Pluto and Saturn square Uranus are quite tight at different points. This is similar to the alignment that happened in 2008 to 2011 when we had the Saturn Uranus Pluto T square. And of course, that moment of tremendous crisis. Um, and then we move from 2023 to 2027 into a Saturn Neptune conjunction. So we're in the square now. That'll be the time period of the conjunction, which will be the end of a whole cycle and the beginning of a new cycle. And so many of the themes that we're working with now could complete in a sense or come to some kind of resolution and then the beginning of a whole nother cycle with regard to the Saturn Neptune themes. But that's not an easy transit. And so I kind of feel like these transits are all kind of coming together, overlapping with each other. The Uranus square Pluto, the Saturn Neptune, leading to Saturn Pluto, leading into Saturn Uranus and Saturn Neptune. I mean, they're all kind of overlapping in a sequence, and they're all really pretty serious transits with lots of positive potentials, but also with serious, challenging potentials. The last one I'll mention here is there's a Uranus Pluto trine that comes in around 2024. So we're in the square, and then not so far after that, because from the square to a trine is just a 30-degree movement. Um, we move into the trine, which is in 2024, which is a much more kind of harmonious energy and kind of more easy kind of progressive energy that's not so in our face. And so I think that's very hopeful that we'll be moving into that at the what I hope will be the end of a really big process of transformation. The Pluto return, the Uranus return, all these transits we've been exploring. The Uranus return kind of overlapping with this Uranus trine Pluto period, the U.S. Uranus return coinciding with this Uranus trine Pluto. So that time period in the mid 2020s through the early 2030s, for me, that's the time period that I think is realistic to hope for really profound and hopefully liberating transformation. But we've got a lot to work with from now till then. So, and this is not to say that I'm automatically assuming that Donald Trump will win a second term in office. It's possible he won't, and yet we will be dealing with the aftermath of whatever happens during these 4 years, and so I think there'll be this longer process that we're going to be going through that's catalyzed in this situation here with Trump's election. Okay, let's see what else I've got here. A couple other things that are worth noting. Saturn has moved 180 degrees from where it was at 9/11. So Remember, everything that lives 7, 14, 20 years long goes through a real crossroads. And I think some of what we're dealing with, Saturn was exactly opposite where it was on 9/11 on election day. And I think that we're dealing with a kind of karmic outgrowth of many things that were put in place after 9/11. So I think that's some of the feeling of this moment. And then the Saturn return of 9/11 is more like 2030 to 2032. So that kind of overlaps. There's a potential for like the end of a whole cycle that relates to 9/11, and then the beginning of a whole another cycle. Um, uh, 9/11 itself was the Saturn return of the World Trade Center opening. And so these 30-year cycles are incredibly important. And so these are some last thoughts. I personally feel that with the election of Trump, we are beginning something like a 15-year process, which I think could have a feeling of the time period in each of our lives that starts with our Saturn return around age 28, extends through the midlife transits, and completes with Saturn opposite Saturn around age 43 to 44, about a 15-year individuation process. Obviously, the stakes are much larger. Um, than the drama that unfolds for most individuals during this time. And really, the analogy doesn't do any justice to the fact that the individuation process collective humanity is going through right now is coinciding with the end of an entire planetary era, the end of the 65 million year Cenozoic era, and the beginning of what has been called the Anthropocene. The analogy is meant to evoke the immense challenge that we as individuals have during our midlife process regarding facing our personal demons, shadow, and underworld. Obviously, a big part of this situation we're in is the climate crisis and the fact that this administration denies that there's a climate crisis, and all of the scientists that say that these 20 years are the crucial years that we have to transform, or we are in real danger. So my hope is that this is going to catalyze exactly what needs to happen during this 15, 20 years, and that as we get through it, that we'll come out the other side and hopefully be in an evolved consciousness position that has learned from its shadow mistakes and is moving forward in a positive direction. And really, for deep change to occur, this is what is required. We each must do our own work to face our individual shadow and transform our relationship with it from a relationship of shame to one of self love. Um, Groff, Lloyd deMause, Alice Miller, and others would add the crucial factor of birthing practices and child rearing practice as incredibly important for the future of humanity. This, along with political work, the mass demonstrations, and other political actions that will be crucial to hold back the worst potentials which we are facing. Those references to Groff, Lloyd deMause, and Alice Miller, they all really focus on the incredibly devastating consequences of child abuse and the trauma of birth. It's especially when the birth trauma is overlaid with early child abuse that you get the kind of psyche that is so oriented towards revenge and violence and war. I've known about Lloyd deMause for some time because Groff talks about him as someone that really affirms his perinatal theory and sees it at work in history. But I'd never really read Lloyd deMause. I was drawn to read him in the last couple of days, and I've just been blown away by, I think, how relevant his work is to our current historical situation. I really recommend checking out his book, which I have listed here in my notes. I'll just mention it. The Origins of War and Child Abuse. You can find it online at psychohistory.com for free. It's just there. And it really makes a very compelling argument for the roots of violence being in the oppressive circumstances of birth and early childhood. Um, and so he would argue that there's no way we're going to avoid future wars until we transform our child rearing practices. And, we can look at what's going on in the United States. Child rearing practices have improved in many areas, and I think we're seeing it in something like the millennial generation, really the best child rearing practices that have ever existed in a sense, in terms of just a kind of constant uh, focus on really being there for the child in lots of ways, and maybe in an overprotective way that has its challenges. But I think all of that love that this new generation, or some of which are receiving, has to do with this very hopeful, progressive potential. I think it's inevitable as those young people get older and come into power that we're going to see different kinds of policies and tendencies. Demas gives the example of Austria, which a few years ago made it illegal to beat children, a law that doesn't exist here in the United States. And he looks at how Austria has transformed and how it has become much more egalitarian society, and how it has become much less warlike. Let's see. Is there anything else I want to say about that? On the other side is the still ongoing tendency of especially those of a fundamentalist religious persuasion, of which we have many in the United States. That kind of patriarchal religious system is tends to be incredibly abusive to children, and I think um, that's why we're seeing so many people in that category who have a kind of eagerness to go to war. Um, let's see. Okay, so the last thing I have here is Donald Trump's chart and transits, and I'm not going to really explore these except very briefly. I think it's worthy of a whole nother video, which I will do at some point, carefully reviewing Trump's natal chart, and then carefully going into his powerful transits that are happening throughout this first term, and talking about their potential. But I'll just point out, you can see that Jupiter-Pluto square that we talked about is sitting right on his natal Jupiter. So he's getting Pluto square Jupiter exactly, Jupiter exactly conjunct his natal Jupiter. That potential with Jupiter-Pluto for a kind of triumphant energy, and that potential to rise to power, become the powerful king, uh, and all of the shadow potentials that I named are very much there for Trump personally, and for the collective. But you can see he has this larger alignment of Jupiter square Saturn and Venus, and so Pluto is also approaching an opposition to his natal Saturn. And we talked about that Pluto-Saturn energy just a little while ago, and its potential for um, it's got so much potential for challenging uh, acting out behaviors. It is the archetype of facing the shadow or acting out the shadow. Um, uh, Carl Jung, born with Pluto square Saturn, of course, the modern psychologist that talked about the crucial importance of working with the shadow lest we act it out. And so that's going to be Trump's challenge. Can he um, move through this time without projecting the shadow energy? Saturn Pluto has a lot to do with working with trauma and triggering trauma. And so as his trauma is triggered, the potential for him to project his shadow and seek vengeance is very strong. And he certainly fits the Lloyd Demas theory. And you can look at the fact that Trump himself was very abused as a young child. So that's Trump's Pluto, Jupiter, Saturn energy that's really going to be there for most of the first administration here. Um, let's see, March and April 2017, Pluto moves within 4 degrees opposite his natal Saturn. At the same time, Uranus is exactly square his natal Saturn. Here's Uranus at 20 degrees, square his Saturn at 23 degrees. Of course, it's Pluto square Uranus on his Saturn. That is potentially a very challenging alignment. Saturn Uranus has a lot to do with crisis and crisis management and the potential for a kind of uh, collapse of the ego is the most challenging part of it. It can be a kind of crack up energy. And I'm very concerned about how he will deal with the pressures of the office and the kind of intense scrutiny that he's going to continue to be under. Um, with Saturn also tight on his moon and sun, you can see that right now. Saturn is conjoining his moon and opposing his sun. The level of judgment and criticism that he's facing right now, and the the level with which he is judgmental, and Saturn Moon is like the abandoning mother, or like the negative mother archetype. Saturn Sun can be the negative father archetype. It's quite a kind of heavy energy for him to be living under as he starts his first term. Uh, okay. Major potential for his internal experience to feel like a crisis and with danger of projections. Both Pluto square Jupiter from 14 to 20 and Pluto opposite Saturn from 17 to 23 will dominate his first term in office. Similarly, Shakespeare had Pluto square his natal Jupiter Saturn conjunction during the time period he wrote all the great tragedies, and the possibility that we may all be swept up in an epic Shakespearean drama during these years. The collective exact Saturn Pluto conjunction will oppose Trump's Saturn. So in 19 and 20, that's a pretty deadly, serious time period for him. The collective exact Saturn Uranus square will form a T square with Trump's Pluto in 2021. Also, some concern is Trump's transit of Neptune square to his natal Sun Uranus Moon alignment, 5 degrees from 17 to 24. Here's Neptune. It got to 12 degrees earlier this year, within 5 degrees square is Uranus. It will move tighter in the coming years onto his Sun eventually. Um, Neptune can be the archetype of confusion, and it has something to do with addiction, and it can relate to like dissociative tendencies, escapism, and disorientation. I have some fear that he will be in a kind of very confused, disoriented state under this transit. There is positive potential, of course, for like spiritual awakening, spiritual awareness. It could be as Neptune squares his sun and moon that he might find more compassion, which is a very um, strong potential with Neptune, both Neptune sun and moon, where Neptune moon is like the divine feminine. So hopefully he'll find some of that energy as he moves into that transit. But on the other hand, it has a lot of potential for enmeshment, boundary problems, working with uh, positive projections, the potential for him to be a kind of cult-like figure, guru figure. That's Neptune's sun. So that's a few years off, but uh, what did I write here? It's 5 degrees from 17 to 24. It's more on the sun. It's 20 to 24. Okay. Some final hopeful thoughts. Archetypal astrology and the principles found in the work of Stan Grof remind us that there is an inner healing force within each of us and in the collective psyche as well. This healing force is always working in our lives, and if we cooperate with it, the healing happens faster. It is much more powerful than any act of the problem solving intellect, and it is attempting to guide and support us at all times. We must only be receptive to the guidance and tune into it. there is an evolution of consciousness at work, and there are so many more evolved, awake people on the planet compared to the 1930s or any other time in history. And so the likelihood of a much more enlightened response to our situation, especially having gone through the 1930s, um, is a strong potential. And so, as much as I am fearful about the coming time, I'm also um, very hopeful about the positive consciousness that will be um, necessitated and called forth for all of us at this time. And there is this healing force that is trying to draw that um, energy uh, out of us or into us. Um, Groff says that healing often happens homeopathically, and when symptoms get worse, it can be a good sign. The idea in homeopathy is that you attempt to amplify the symptoms rather than take them away. The universe seems to exaggerate symptoms this way, both for us as individuals, the way our dysfunctional patterns will tend to have more and more consequences over time until we accept the wake up call, take a look at ourselves, and then do healing work towards transformation, and also as collectives. So we have this paradox where there is clearly an evolution of consciousness with more and more freedoms that have come throughout history, and yet still there are certain unaddressed shadow aspects which tend to grow like a cancer until a healing crisis is catalyzed, and there is no choice but to accept that there is an illness and that help is necessary. Clearly, we have been in such a healing crisis for some time, but it seems to be coming to a climax. As dangerous as this is, it is hopeful to realize that if enough people recognize the seriousness of the illness, long standing problems can finally be confronted and transformed. Expanded states of consciousness can be incredibly helpful. When we expand consciousness, we can see more perspectives on things. We can move out of fear consciousness and discover love consciousness. Move out of shame and into forgiveness. Let go of hate and embrace joy. We remember the power of redemption, the presence of the Divine Mother, and the support of our ancestors who are seeing us now and are trying to support us. All of the evidence from transpersonal psychology and other wisdom traditions suggests that we are not ever alone here. The earth is loved by so many beings throughout the material and non material universe, and many people have reported loving contact with these beings as sources of support and guidance. One last thought. It is important for each of us to correct for projections of our own unconscious birth trauma material. When late stage birth energies are activated in the collective or the individual, things can shift from a mere sense of intense life and death struggle to the level of an apocalyptic crisis. If we can realize that this energy is really coming from within us, we can work with it in healthy ways, with the understanding that even though it feels apocalyptic, the psychological truth is that we are actually very close to total transformation. The key about the last stage of birth, when the baby is actually born, is that when it is relived experientially, it always comes as a sudden and totally unexpected surprise. There is then a sudden release of incredible tensions and the reconnection with the mother. Even though we seem to be entering into a long birth labor process, we've already been at it for a very long time, and these may actually be the final contractions of a crucial stage of our collective death rebirth journey. Many people are identifying at this time as light workers, seeing their mission as incarnating the light of the divine and bringing it down to earth at this crucial moment in history. I, for one, feel this is the moment I chose to incarnate for. It's time to get to work. You know, for me, this moment, as dark as it feels very similar to the end of the Lord of the Rings saga. That moment when Frodo and Sam finally drop the ring into Mount Doom. Um, at that moment, it seems like it's the darkest moment. All of our heroes are surrounded by enemies. It seems as though all is lost. And then the Eagles come and rescue Frodo and Sam very unexpectedly, and the dark side collapses. And so this is often what it feels like when someone goes through a birth labor process, that it seems apocalyptically intense, and then just on the other side is the birth, the rebirth. And so with that, here are my notes. Rick Tarnas is throughout this whole presentation. I use many examples that I learned from him and that you'll find in his life's work, Cosmos and Psyche, Intimations of a New Worldview. You can also find online, just type in World Transits 20 to 2020, an overview, which he wrote back, I think, in 2010 or 11. And you can see where he was already kind of seeing the potential for a lot of what has happened. And then I also referenced Lloyd DeMoss, which I mentioned you can find online, and Groff's book Psychology of the Future is a great summary work of his main ideas. And again, you can get a 20% discount on a 2-hour consultation for yourself or a friend through January 15th. And please check out my website at www.stelz.biz. Sending many blessings and prayers and love for us all.